Are we going? Oh. So I'm gonna wait till 6:30 on the dot to start, just for
okay.
Maybe coming and they wanted to start at 6:30. So I'll do our introduction for everyone that's coming in at 6:30. So if you're here, just literally wait, and 6:30 we will definitely start.
Okay.
Just I'm doing a new book at the moment on black art and the criminological imagination, and there's a significant paragraph in there in the Race Today collective.
Okay. Oh, I'd like to see that. Thank you.
Because the thing is, when I was growing up, in some respects, it's not that they were the elders, but they were the forerunners of when I became an activist, because we used to have to sit in all the bookshops.
Yeah.
And I mean, and if you take someone like CLR James, the thing is with CLR James, you know, it's like Edward Braithwaite. You could sit in a room, you could sit there for 3 hours and you don't say anything. And Darkus, I was very sad when he passed, because we've just, one of our activists in Birmingham, Beanie Brown, has just had a stroke.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, Beanie had a stroke about 3 weeks ago. And I've been trying to get some of the older activists to write their autobiography, because a lot of them, I saw Eric Huntley recently in Sheffield.
Okay. Yeah.
And so for me, you know, the Race Today collective, when I started re-looking at it again, probably a lot of the younger people may not understand that, but it's definitely with you guys, if you weren't read, so I have many fond memories of what you guys did, and it's still very influential, if I'm being honest.
Thank you. I'm sorry about Beanie. Okay, can we talk after, Martin?
Yeah, we'll talk after.
I've just recommended Beanie to somebody else, and I didn't know he'd had a stroke.
Yeah, he had a major stroke.
Okay, all right.
Right, everyone, welcome to BLAM UK's first ever webinar. I'd like to thank you all for coming today. For those of you who do not know what BLAM UK is and what we represent, BLAM UK stands for Black Learning, Achievement and Mental Health. We are an educational and advocacy charity and not-for-profit, and we're based mainly in South London and Brixton. We've been running for 3 years now, and we focus a lot of our projects around young people and including and improving young people's well-being, particularly using Black history as the forum to do that, because we know that a lot of young Black people, because of the history of racism and the ever-present white supremacy in this country and globally, there's a lot of negative narratives about being Black. So we use history as a form to improve mainly the racial esteem of young Black people, and that will in turn improve their self-esteem as well. And we go into schools all across London, particularly working in Lambeth. We do teacher training, and what's been quite exciting that during a lockdown, we've actually kind of expanded how we support young people by providing Black history online for young people. So if you know anybody who is young, who would really benefit from being able to access Black history, particularly the ages 7 to 16, check out our website www.blamuk.org, and you can find out more about our resources. And then we also host events like this to kind of empower the Black community mainly, and to kind of have intergenerational dialogue. There we go. And I think all too often we don't get to have this dialogue. So I think today is going to be really special because we're going to be looking particularly at Black British activism from around the 70s and 80s. And I think it's really important because a lot of conversations that I have been having, panels that I've been invited to, a lot of people think that Black activism in the UK is a new thing, and actually they're really surprised that we're showing solidarity with America. So I think it's really important we have these sort of discussions to kind of bring to light the radical tradition that we have in the UK here in particular, and also just to kind of find out about new techniques and new ways we can continue what we want to do, which is obviously the fight for Black liberation. So I think today's going to be really special. We've got a range of different speakers UK wide, so we've got people based in London and based in the Midlands, so we're going to have a real nice mixture of discussions. I think it's going to happen today, so I'm looking forward to how everything's going to go. So what I'm going to do now is read the bios of each of the speakers, and then I'm going to also allow the speakers to introduce themselves in case I've missed out anything of importance, because I think I always say this, that, you know, no one knows themselves better than the speakers themselves, isn't it? So that is my mindset in terms of ensuring that they introduce themselves. So first up, we have Dr. Martin Glynn, who is known as the academic who turned research into hip hop. And that's what The Guardian has said. He's a criminologist, an educator, a theatre director, and a dramatist with over 35 years experience working in criminal justice, public health, and educational setting. As a writer, Martin has written for BBC One Casualty, has written and directed a number of theatre productions, and published lots of poetry and children's books. He's also a leading scholar on the usage of data verbalization, which he will talk to us about. And he, you know, is really keen on wanting information not only to be accessed by the elite, but by the community as well. He is very, you know, passionate about ensuring that essay and research is translated to the communities that he works with. So Martin Glynn first used the method of data verbalization with his own work, translating a 10,000 word conference speech about mass incarceration of Black men into a 12-minute track. And this track sought the attention of Busted Rhymes, who tweeted it, and also Black Lives Matter. And this tune is on iTunes at the moment, so if you're interested in that, please check that out. He's also writing a book which is going to be published in 2019, or is actually being published. It's called Data Speaking and Telling Stories, Data Verbalization. And next we have Leila Hassan Howe, who is a seasoned activist and writer. Her activism began in the 1960s and led to her work in the likes of Darcus Howe and Olive Morris and Eric Hutley. She's also campaigned to the Arts Council for Notting Hill Carnival to be recognised as an art form. She's also worked for the Institute of Race Relations, a think tank from the 1970s, and heavily involved with Race Today as an editor in 1985. And also she contributed to the Race Day anthology as well. And we have lastly Zita Holbourne, who is a trade union activist and author and arter. She is an award-winning community campaigner, a visual artist, a curator, poet. She studied art and graphic design at the London College of Printing in the Watford School of Art. Zita has over 30 years of experience working as a graphic designer, illustrator, and makeup artist, and also exhibits a range of cultural and community and political events. She centers and creates political, cultural art exhibitions to challenge racism. And she recently was one of the contributors to Daughters of New Africa, an international anthology of writing and by women of African descent, which was led by Margaret Busby. And she's also the co-chair of the Black Activist Rising Against Cuts. So we've got a really powerful range of people here. If there's anything that I haven't added, please feel free to add this in when we're doing any questions and things like that. So I'm going to move on now to the first question. Is everyone okay with that? Yep. So the first question that I'd like you guys to answer today for us is how much influence do you think the communist and Pan-African organizing in Africa and in the Caribbean in the 1960s and 70s had on the UK Black British movement?
So who wants to go first?
So I was surprised that you began with the 60s and 70s, because Pan-Africanism, of course, the father was W.E. Du Bois, and that dates back to the 30s. CLR's Black Jacobins, which talks about the slave revolt and Africanism, is 1939, and Ghana got its independence in 57. So Pan-Africanism isn't a phenomenon of the 60s and 70s. I take it you've chosen the 60s and 70s because that's when the Black movement took up the ideology of Pan-Africanism as one of the vehicles for liberation. So indeed, it had a huge influence, particularly the writings of people like Senghor and Nkrumah, George Padmore, who were all Pan-Africanists, and who put forward the ideology that people of African descent should kind of band together and fight for liberation together. And these were key for the anti-colonial movements in Africa, in Ghana, in Kenya, and later, of course, in Mozambique. So it had a huge influence on us. We were all aware of the writing, we were all aware of the movements, and it certainly influenced the politics and the ideology of what we were putting forward at the time.
From my perspective, I was a youth at the time, and I suppose I'm not even going to say angry. I was just hurt, traumatized. And growing up back in those days, when we discovered Pan-Africanism, we discovered Rasta, it was a kind of revelation. But my generation, we weren't really prepared for it, because the generation that paved the way were a few years older than us. So for people like myself, not only was it influential, but it kind of laid the foundation for what I've now become. I didn't know it at the time. It was very different back in the day, but the kind of work that the Race Today collective did, the bookshops, the Walter Rodney bookshop, with formerly Bogle Overture, New Beacon, the Race Today collective were one of the most avid publishers of ideas that we couldn't get, because when I was at school and college, you could never get access to anything written by Black people. Suddenly there were several bookshops. There was bookshops in Tottenham. The bookshops started to creep up, and as the younger ones, it's not like now when you sat in a room full of people that had that political knowledge. You really had to sit and listen. You know, you couldn't, it wasn't that you couldn't speak, but what people were saying was about changing your life. And so I found, I suppose, active listening through my participation way back then. And without that foundation, I wouldn't be sitting here talking to now. I wouldn't have got anything that I've got if it wasn't for that. And it was the foundation. So that was my experience at that time.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to mention Claudia Jones, actually, because you've mentioned Communist Party. And Claudia Jones was a leading member of the Communist Party, but of course, when she came to the UK, she had a key role in the Notting Hill Carnival, in communicating and organising with our communities. But like Leila, my mind, when I think about Pan-Africanism, goes back in time, you know, decades before. For me, I was born in the late 60s, so growing up in the 70s, we certainly wouldn't be able to rely on our schooling for these histories. And often what we learnt was an oral history until we could access those bookshops that have just been mentioned. And the 5th Pan-African Congress, which took place in Manchester in 1945. I had the pleasure of co-chairing and helping to organise the 70th anniversary event to mark the 5th Pan-African Congress in Manchester. And I think that was important because it was a 3-day conference, but it also raised that awareness of that history in Manchester and brought it to, you know, several different generations. People came from all over the UK to the 3-day conference, and the first day was actually run by young people, particularly Black students, who led the first day and the first activity. So those movements definitely influenced us, but I think they were influencing us way before the 60s and 70s. Mm-hmm. In terms of how we access the information about what was happening, that was challenging for me growing up to get access to that.
I think it's really powerful that you guys have, really mentioned the fact that in terms of Black activism in the UK around Pan-Africanism, it's been a long tradition. You've had the first Pan-African Congress that was in London, and you had the other ones that were in Manchester as well. So I think it's important to realise that in terms of Black activism and organising, particularly in Britain, the UK has a long tradition in doing that. So thank you for highlighting that.
Can I also, I just wanted to add something, that the Race Today Collective, alongside the bookshops, organised a radical book festival. I mean, that was the kind of book, that's the place you had to go to buy stuff. That was where you heard those speakers speak, where you heard African speakers, you heard Caribbean speakers. I mean, this was not something that you access on video. And the thing that I got from when I was growing up is how organized we actually were. People talk about organizing online, and I understand that because of the way the medium is. But some of the mass rallies and protests that I was part of were organized, I don't want to say the hard way, but it was word of mouth. It was artists. It was when I used to listen to the poetry of Linton Kwesi Johnson, or I had to read the works of CLR James, that I found when I was growing up difficult to read. But the older people above me who told me about those movements in the 40s and 50s, it was almost like going to a nightclub. In a sense, you couldn't get access to this world if you weren't prepared to put the work in through the reading, through the stuff that went before. And I think that as certainly me as a young activist, I learned the hard way because I was raw, I wasn't educated. But when I was around educated people, that's how I learned how to grow up, basically, because I realized the world was bigger than me. And it's only based on, if you meet some of the people in the past that I met, it was one of those experiences that it was very, very humbling. It was really, really humbling. So what I'm saying is, when I remember the Third World Book Festival, and I was a poet at the time, and people like Linton, we were like the children of Linton. And I always remember, and I said this to Eric Huntley a while back, I never ever got to perform at that festival because I wasn't good enough. I wasn't political enough. I didn't know enough. I just thought, oh, this is a platform. So even when I think about those places, they were the places where nobody really thinks about how those things were organized. Who's the people that put these things together? It was a huge effort. And it was difficult to access, but it happened. And that's what's important.
And that was without internet. So it speaks even more volumes to the level of solidarity globally as well, I guess. I'm going to move on to question number 2. Music and art have always been a vital part of Black resistance. We had the Fisimbas, also known as the Young Lions, one of a number of radical Black organisations operating in southeast London in the 1970s, who held Saturday schools for young people and held sessions for its members. And they also formed a sound system called Jar Shaka. The sound system promoted public conscious music that reflected the cultural beliefs of young Black people. We also had dub poetry and dread poetry, which Dr. Martin Glynn has just mentioned, being used as a vital art form to invoke ideas of Black resistance and freedom. We had the Black Arts Group that formed around the 1980s as well, with a lot of community support, because the community really wanted an arts movement that reflected how Black people were feeling. And then also, all these works and projects have been described as very Pan-African and very radical. So my question to the panel is, how have you furthered or preserved the legacy of Black British intellectual art production?
Can I start? Well, I think I've always been involved in the arts. So I've been an activist and an artist all my life, but the two things are fused for me. So I come from a background of being a singer-songwriter, dancing. I'm a performance poet. I'm an author and a writer. I'm a vocalist, and I'm in an all Black women singing group now that sing for freedom and sing for our ancestors, Nari Collective. And I'm also a visual artist. I founded the Roots Culture Identity Art Exhibition in my role in trade unions. I'm the National Vice President of the PCS Union and the Joint National Chair of Artists Union England. And so the fusion of activism through community activism, trade unionism, and all of the different genres of creativity I'm involved in are part of the same thing. I use arts and activism to campaign for equality, freedom, and justice. But I founded the Roots Culture Identity Art Exhibition through the trade union movement. I sit on the TUC Race Relations Committee as one of the recommendations that came out of the TUC Stephen Lawrence task group, which was to create a platform for young Black artists, because the issues we're talking about, the Black arts group of the 1980s and things they faced, we're still facing today. I'm published by one of the oldest Black publishers in the UK. My book, Striving for Equality, Freedom and Justice, which fuses the poetical with the political, is published by Howe, and they used to publish the Caribbean Times, African Times, and Asian Times. And so I don't know about, how I've influenced things or using the term intellectual, but I know I've lived and breathed using the arts to get out political messages. You can see some of my paintings on the wall behind me, to campaign for justice and equality. My art is often used in flyers and communications around campaigns that I'm involved in or supporting. And I really believe in arts, that have a meaning. Arts are healing as well. It's an act of resistance for me to create art, I think, but it's also an act of self-care and an act of healing to actually document the things we're going through and the traumas we're going through in terms of racism and injustice and other discriminations we face. But also it's exhausting as an activist dealing with those things. So even through lockdown, I've created a piece of visual art daily, which has served as a visual diary of what's happening and events over the last few months.
From my perspective, I went from a youth on the road to dub poetry, to reading a lot, a dramatist. I used to write for the Real McCoy. So I did TV, film, radio. When I went into academia, I want to skip forward because I've done a lot of the stuff. I've done a lot of created stuff. My biggest problem is the environment that produced so-called knowledge and ideas through research was always eluded me. I read everybody else's research. About 4 or 5 years ago, I was invited to speak in a conference in New Orleans to present my research. And when you do race-specific research, very few academic journals publish race-specific work, not around criminal justice. And because most of my work in the last 40 years has been around criminal justice. So I had to do a piece, a 20-minute talk on mass incarceration in the UK. And I looked at it one day and I just ripped it up. I said, I can't go to New Orleans and do this for 20 minutes. So I went to a brethren of mine who was a hip hop producer and I said, look, I've deconstructed this thing. Can you put some music with it? Because I said, look, I need to communicate my research to the youth and I need to communicate my research to offenders, people in jail, people on the streets. I need to put it through headphones. Anyway, we created a piece called Silence. So we put it out. Busta Rhymes got it. Black Lives Matter 4 or 5 years ago got it. But what that enabled me to do is to connect my politics about making things accessible in terms of knowledge. But I also wanted to show academics that the knowledge that they produce, unless they're producing it that enables community people who are oppressed to understand what we do and translate it, then it just becomes like mainly self-promotion. And if you look at COVID-19 and BAME, or I don't like the term BAME, but Black people and COVID-19, I wrote a piece that's out there on Spotify at the moment, which is about COVID-19 and the impact on the Black community. So for me, my apprenticeship's been about 40 odd years in the making because I've passed through drama, theatre, all of the mediums. But what I did want to do is to create a content created messaging system to promote research data. And so now, just in closing on this point, the next book I'm doing is a book called black art and the criminological imagination, because my argument is that, like George Floyd, the first people that kicked into action when George Floyd was murdered was graffiti artists. The first people that commented on it really were people that sung and presented hip hop lyrics. That was art. So what I want to do in this book, because I'm at the age now where it's about legacy. So it's less about me creating a career that I've had and more about what the Race Today Collective did, is to create a body of work to leave behind for the next generation of scholars and young people to pore over it, pick it up and run with it. So for me, I've just decided that all I've got to put my energies into is to create tools for the younger generation to pick it up, do what I did, read, argue, debate, but to give that younger generation the tools in which to make the differences that I know that they so badly talk about and they so badly need. So that's, so a bit like the previous speaker, I was, you know, I'm still heavily involved, but I've just matured into where I feel the most important thing for me is to take research data and make it accessible to the streets, especially when it comes to disproportionality in criminal justice. So that's my bit.
Okay, my turn now. Okay, so as I've said, I was a member of the Race Today Collective, and during our time we had a huge arts movement called Creation for Liberation, which was named by Linton, which put on art exhibitions, poetry, reviewed and discussed theatre. And so I suppose what I would say my contribution, or our contribution, is as a group of people still working around this, is that we've published an anthology. And in this anthology, we have a section on Creation for Liberation, Race Today, Art and Culture. And I think the aim of this is something which Martin has touched upon, which is that we're not starting from scratch. There's a legacy and there's a tradition in this country of Black artists, Black poets, Black theatre makers, actors, actresses, musicians. There's a huge tradition which can support the young people today who want to move forward with their art and culture, so that people aren't in a vacuum. There is this tradition which hasn't had widespread publicity or isn't known about widely. But one of the first things that we've done is in October last year is publish a book which contains just some of snippets of that cultural movement of the 70s, so that people can get an idea of the discussion. And the reason that's important is that it was a radical movement. It was a movement that you wanted art and culture as a force to change things. It wasn't static. It wasn't saying this is what's happening, so what? It was this is what's happening and what can we do about it? How can we change it? So I would say that that's our contribution. The other contribution which we're in the process of making is to get Race Today and Creation for Liberation and all its works on a digital platform. And I think that will be a huge bonus to the generations going forward to understand what it is we achieved at that time.
I also wanted to add, in terms of Leila's point, is this: as a young poet growing up, if it wasn't for those bookshops, the Walter Rodney Bookshop, New Beacon, Race Today, a lot of those poets that you see now, from myself, Benjamin Zephaniah, there was a range of poets at the time. Because one of the key things, and I remember speaking to Eric Huntley recently, which doesn't happen to an extent with the younger generation because the mediums are different, is the notion of publishing. We used to perform a lot, but we also had to document what we performed. And a lot of us, we never had access to recording studios. And if it wasn't for people like the Race Today Collective, and if it wasn't for some of the movements, because we had the Black Arts movement in Manchester, I remember the Black Art Gallery in Tottenham that we used to go to, that when you'd go to a performance, or the Africa Centre, I mean, when I used to perform at the Africa Centre, you'd open for people like the Last Poets. You'd be introducing Ngugi wa Thiong'o. You'd get these world-renowned writers. Edward Braithwaite talked about Caribbean nation language. So what I'm dealing with is, I don't ever remember a time where there was a separation between activism and art. You was an activist who had a role to talk your truth to power through your art, alongside, and in some respects, unlike a lot of activity I see today, where political activity, where the poet comes on at the end or the artist comes on at the end. To tell you the truth, we used to open the event, we'd be in the middle of it, I never saw separation. And so the importance of the documentation of this has to also embed its way in, not just to the national curriculum or the primary school curriculum. It has to overturn some of the outmoded thinking within higher education at the degree, master's and PhD level, so that we're producing a body of work that not only lasts the test of time, but also transforms society, because we know all the people we've mentioned have transformed our consciousness. It's just that the powers that be have blocked that consciousness. And luckily, we've kept that alive.
I think it's really powerful that you guys have mentioned some of the names like Last Poets and Thumongi, because I'm avid followers of their work, and I never even knew there was that kind of crossover in terms of them in the UK, but also in terms of activism. I think the fact that we don't even know that was something that happened, it's very difficult to continue what you don't even know about. And I think it's important to kind of look at more ways in which art can become much more central in terms of activism in today. I feel like when I see a lot of poetry, it's like done separately. I very rarely go to like events that are political in which they have a mirage of the two. And I think, yeah, it's a tradition that I haven't seen continuing, that I would obviously love, and I think it's obviously very important. And I'm even learning about the Black Arts Group myself. I only learned about it when I went to an event that Somerset House did, and it was looking at the work of Horace over 50 years, and then looking at particularly Black British art. And I found, a lot of niche Black British artists that I'd never heard about, and if not for that exhibition at Somerset House, I would have never even heard about the Black Arts Groups. I think it's important that these legacies are drawn upon and they're not lost. And I like the idea that Dr. Martin was saying, particularly around more mediums in terms of being able to publish more. I think the art of publishing is not pushed as frequently. I think maybe because we don't necessarily read as much books. I think because the medium has obviously gone online now, things are much more digital. People don't necessarily feel the need to have books as much. Sadly, we've seen a lot of bookshops are closing. So I think it's kind of changing the idea how we see books and publishing as a world that's more attainable to us, I would say as well. So thank you for that.
Thing on this, I know there's time issue. One of the things when I was coming up as a performance poet is that I actually wasn't trying to be a performance poet. I actually wanted to get a publishing deal, and that was difficult to get. And I was advised by older poets. Actually, Linton Kwesi Johnson performed at my school, for example. And when I later on performed with him, he was like, "Am I that old?" When I told him that I performed, he came to my school. But we actually went out and performed because we couldn't get the publishing deals to try and get some exposure. But when even though that was in the late 90s, actually, it was still an underground movement of poetry. And the other thing I just wanted to mention is that there's a really good resource at the Women's Library in Goldsmiths around the Black women artists in the 1980s, well, men as well, but it's a focus on women in that library. And I only came across that resource because I had a solo art exhibition in the library, which was focused on being inspired by the archives in the library.
In relationship to that, one of the times I went to the Third World Radical Bookshop, for the first time I was introduced to the poetry of Jane Cortez and Sonia Sanchez. And we also had Jean Breeze, Merle Collins. Mm-hmm. But at the time, we all occupied space equally, but different. And there were times when it was a women's only event, and we accepted that because at the time there were issues that were discussed in that particular way. But again, and I remember Alison and Busby published a book called Daughters of Africa, which is a huge anthology of significant poetry at the time. So again, I go back to people like Race Today, the bookshops. They laid the foundation for people like myself, who, in spite of being a performer, always wanted, like you said, about not being able to get published. And it's always been my mission not just to get published in a range of mediums, but also to encourage the next generation of even undergrad students to publish their dissertations, master's students to publish their dissertation, to publish anything, because I don't believe that people don't read. we're in a time of popular culture, but in my experience, people read, they just read different things in different ways. But what I do know is, and I go back to when I'm in prison, when I'm working in prisons, when guys in prison find out that you've written a book, they are mesmerized by just somebody that's written a book because they've been denied access to authors. And I feel that in our society, you're surrounded by published people, and it's just about making ourselves accessible to create those magical moments for young people and older people around the writings that we've produced.
Okay, I just briefly want to say, I mean, I agree with what the speakers have said, but bear in mind what we did as a collective, which could probably, I wouldn't say be replicated, but could be considered. As we were just a group of 15 young Black people, you know, Asians, West Indians and Africans. And we published Mikey Smith, Jean Binter-Breeze, Two of Linton. We brought out a regular cultural journal, and we encouraged discussion and debate. So it is possible for people to get together and do things. You know, we don't have to be reliant on what is going on. You know, if like-minded people can join together and actually do things and create things for themselves and for other people.
Thank you. I think it's important to people to be reminded that, you know, all movements start as nothing, and people coming together is what makes movements a thing. So I think people need to be re-energized and think of new ideas, new ways of doing things. I think people always say that history doesn't always repeat itself, but often rhymes. So I think kind of looking in the past, seeing how things were done and seeing how for today's generation, how we can do things going forward. So thank you for sharing that, Leila, and everyone else. So I'm going to move on to question number 3. So I start with Stuart Hall, who was you know, a really important sociologist around the 70s and 80s, and he states that as a way of understanding what ethnicity is today, we can look at how the idea of Africa, not only as a country that actually located on any map, but a country of the mind alone, enabled young children of Caribbean migrants, the second generation, to survive life in the United Kingdom in the 1970s. It was cultural forms such as the music technology of the recording studio, the sound system, the vinyl disc, as much as symbolic languages of Rastafarianism that allowed them not just to survive, but to also acquire a sense of self-pride, the symbolic connectedness, and their own way of styling their bodies, characterized as showed their new way of being, or rather becoming Black in post-war history of multicultural Britain. So why was the Cultural Revolution, you know, so important to the Black British community? And that's the question. Don't know who wants to lead on it.
No. Does anybody want to? So, I mean, the Cultural Revolution is part of the larger movement that was taking place in Britain at that time. So you had the first generation of immigrants, and then the second generation, very influenced by Black Power, by Pan-Africanism, by the movement for change that was going on internationally. The war in Vietnam. There were other big international movements where we felt we were on the move, and change was really something which we bought into and we believed we could achieve. So the Cultural Revolution, in terms of what was going on in art, music, poetry, theatre, writing, you know, people like Ntozake Shange, Toni Morrison, all of that just fed into an expression of freedom. For us, it was an expression of our own freedom. That's why I think the Cultural Revolution was so important to the Black community, activism at that time. And then, of course, with Bob Marley and reggae and the whole Rasta Caribbean influence of getting up and standing up and fighting for your rights and redemption song, it was very much a community that was, maybe some people would want to make comparisons with today with the Black Lives Matter movement, but it was a community seeking out different forms of expression for cultural change, political change and economic change. And that's why the culture at its side was very, very important to those movements.
From my perspective, I followed sound system. I sought solace in a bass line and the music and the DJs. I love the sounds, the smells. I used to go 12 Tribes dancers. There were occasionally you'd get beef, but the place, certainly when I followed, I remember the first time I listened to Shaka play, Coxsone, V-Rocket, Mafia, Quaker. There was a whole sound system culture. Out of that culture came one contribution to reggae music that, again, we've never had a definitive book on that, which is the evolution of Lovers Rock. And the relevance of Lovers Rock is, and it's very interesting, me being older, and I talk to my son about if he goes to a dance, it's grime or hip hop. But back in the day, when Lovers Rock came along, you found yourself having to ask a woman to dance. The music was very different. I mean, when you've been taking a lot of heat from what was going on in the streets, you went to a house party, because the one thing about Black life, it's hard, it's difficult. And if you went out and listened to Lovers Rock, you'd listen to Burning Spear, you'd listen to Dennis Brown, Gregory Isaacs, you'd listen to that music. But the moment they put on Lovers Rock, you escaped into a fantasy world. And for the duration of listening to that music with Janet Kay and all the great Lovers Rock singers, suddenly you found a way to actually feel uplifted and motivated in the middle of all of this. And then out of that, an amazing event took place in the 80s. It was the first time I ever saw a sound system on stage in a play directed by Amani Naphtali called Ragamuffin. And that was the first time I went into a theater and saw a proper sound system on stage in a dramatic performance. And I can tell you that play was sold out. It was sold out. And then Black Heroes in the Hall of Fame. So the music and the theater, as what's been said before, created different spaces, because I think one of the previous speakers was talking about art as safety and healing. And there weren't many spaces to go. You didn't have access to spaces. So to go to a theater was a big thing, because a lot of sound systems were in dark places. But when you start going into theater, when performance poetry was in art galleries. So the other thing that I experienced growing up is how that movement created access just to be me in a space that you thought previously excluded you. And the reggae music, and also I have to say what was also important at the time, the role of carnival, and also a lot of the soul and R&B singers that came out of that period, because it wasn't just, I was a reggae person, I just liked that stuff. But what would happen is on a Friday night, my friends would go to things like wine bars, where they'd listen to jazz, where they'd listen to Motown. So I found at the time that music, you had a massive amount of choice, you just didn't have a lot of spaces to go to. So for me, feeling safe and comfortable, I mean, when I used to go to sound dances, we used to sing the choruses loud. We used to dance till we sweat. We'd stay out all night and then stay up till 6 o'clock in the morning and then go football, take your football boots and go football. So for me, but none of that would have been possible without the movements that inform the content of a lot of that material. So it was an extension.
Yes, so Lovers Rock was something I was also going to mention. I think it was sort of, the soundtrack of my teens and going forward. And I think, our parents came to the UK and faced those no blacks, no Irish, no dog signs. We had Enoch Powell and the Rivers of Blood. They were catching hell in terms of discrimination in the workplace and in society. We faced discrimination in our schooling, and I grew up in and around Brixton and South London. So I went to a school where the majority of the pupils were black, actually, and largely from the Caribbean too. And so, having that culture, the arts, the music, the sound systems, Lovers Rock, that was really, really important in bringing us together and giving us a sense of pride and a sense of strength and a sense of identity and belonging. And actually, we shouldn't forget that our cultures that we brought to the UK, that we created in the UK and developed in the UK, have become British culture. They have enriched Britain, despite the racism and discrimination that we're still facing even up to this time, it did have a big influence on British culture at large. But for us, it was really important to have those spaces, and we did have to create our own spaces. You know, the poetry collectives that I was in when I was younger, you know, we organized our events, we found venues, we hosted the events, we put them on, we dealt with everything. And that was a good grounding for us on, you know, bringing the arts together, multi-genres, coming together, forming collectives. And that gives us a sense of unity, a sense of family. We formed those creative families. And of course, we have blues as well, that we held in our own homes and so on. So that was massively important in the face of horrific racism, to have spaces where we could come together. But of course, ingrained in those spaces and that in culture was politics. You know, and it helped us to resist and stand up and have strength to face what we had to face outside when the blues finished or the dance finished or whatever it was we were at.
Can't hear you.
Leila, do you have anything that you wanted to add to it?
No, not really. I mean, I was looking at the question, why was it so important? I think everybody's answered it really, that without that, really, I don't think you'd have the big movements you have now in music and in culture that you have today, if it wasn't for what went on before.
I just wanted to add something as well. When the first time I ever went to Jamaica, I met somebody from Trinidad who talked about the term liming. And I said, well, what is liming? And he said, it's a conversation that ends when it finishes. Well, the adaptation of that in reggae dancers and blues parties was reasoning. Because critical thinking, what's called critical thinking now, is what we used to call reasoning. And so you would have reasoning sessions in barbershops where people would stand for hours and reason. There was no fights, there was no conflict, even if it got heated. But there was a sense that the conversation, you served the process of the conversation. So you can see linguistically that the language went from liming to reasoning when it was Rasta. But nowadays, as a criminologist, a lot of the things that young black men are cited for is having no patience. When you look at the sentencing of young black men, because they say, can't you sort out conflict? And so what you realize is that one of the things about intergenerational practice is the way that the generations share ideas to reduce some of that anxiety and that frustration and that the temperament that I see incarcerated in criminal justice. In schools, pupil referral units, where a young person gets frustrated because they're not being heard. Young people on the streets are not being heard. And if you look at Section 60 with stop and search, you look at how the system can actually take your voice away, because when you get arrested by the police, you've got a right to remain silent. And basically what that means is, if you speak, we can use it against you. So we still need spaces for people to vent and to talk and to have conversations that last as long as they need to last, so that we can preserve some of our own positive energy, because we get incarcerated and we get arrested for losing our temper. So in some respects, what I learned back then, when I was an angry person at the time, when I used to meet an elder, and that elder would say, listen, sit down, young man, I'm going to tell you a story. I want you to listen. When we'd listen to them, and they may even be playing domino at the same time, they may be drinking rum, but it was that time that the elders would take that actually gave you a little bit of a grounding. And then when you went onto the streets, you realize that the police didn't understand that. They never listened to us. So the music, if you listen to the music and the lyrics, they reflected exactly, whether it's poetry, whether it's DJ, whatever it was, it reflected that we just weren't listened to. And the music and a lot of the early stage in the 70s and 80s. And the first time I ever heard Linton's Dread, Beat and Blood, I was 17 at the time. And the first time I ever heard that album, I suddenly said, I want to do that. And that's what I ended up doing. Because when Linton produced that album, it spoke to people like me. And then I discovered he wrote as well as perform. So creating safe spaces to speak, to be listened to be heard, is even more important now.
Okay. I just wanted to add one thing, which I think I should say, is that if you want to really look at the Cultural Revolution and the history of it, you'd find no better place than to look at the history of the Notting Hill Carnival and how it started, who started it, and how it's developed until today, and the huge battles both on the street, politically and culturally, that were fought to maintain Carnival and to make sure that Carnival remains a British institution. And that would be very important for anybody interested in trying to find a linear moment in the Black community's history and culture. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you all for sharing just that insight into the cultural nuances at the time, what was going on and what was influencing behaviour. So I think that's really important to know. So I'm going to move on to question number 4 now. Key groups for community organising in 1973 in the UK were the Fasimba, the Black Liberation Front, the Black Unity and Freedom Party, and the Black Panther movement. Which of these movements that were prevalent in the 1970s resonated with you the most, and why?
So I was a member of
smiling.
Yeah, no, I'm laughing because none of them resonates more than the other. I was a member of Black Unity and Freedom Party, but that was by chance. I met people who came and talked to me about Black liberation. I was working at the Institute of Race Relations at the time, and they talked to me about Black liberation and said, why don't you come to some meetings? I did, and so I joined the Black Unity and Freedom Party. But if Panthers had come and met me and said, why don't you come to meetings? I would have joined the Panthers. I mean, you have to accept that it was a movement. There were nuances within the different groups, within BUFP, the Panthers. And you talked about some, I mean, BUFP was in Manchester as well. But we've talked about Birmingham earlier. There was a huge Black Power movement led by Beanie Brown in the Midlands. So you've chosen some which were very much London-based, I think. But so the answer to your question is, none of them resonated most with me because it was a movement and we were really in slightly different ways, all fighting for the same thing.
For my relation with it is very much the same. It was never about taking sides. Because everybody represented something different, and if you put the whole thing together, you'd have one thing. It was never like that, and I wouldn't even say it was variations on a theme. And it was the way it was back then. It wasn't like a membership organization like the standard parties. These were spaces that you could attend and listen and invited in, because there was one objective, is to raise your consciousness. Can you go out there and apply what it is you're reading about Walter Rodney? Can you understand what C.L.R. James was talking about when he talked about the Black Jacobeans? You might want to express it the way Linton did it, or the way that Darcus Howe did it. Was one of the most fierce debaters I've ever seen. Sivanandan, who, again, a great writer, one of the earliest people to write a scathing attack on Black academics and about their role in society. And you know, when I remember when I got my doctorate, and I remember finding this article that he'd written about Black academics, and it was almost like, I wonder if I'm going to be the butt of his attack if I was then in the 70s. So for me, the same thing. I don't think it was ever a situation about being in people's camps. It's not like, do you like Drake or Lil Wayne? It's not like that. For me, what it was about, and I remember I'm from the Midlands, so I used to have to spend my train fare because I couldn't drive. So when these things was happening in London, the day cost of taking a train, taking a tube, normally you never had no money for sandwiches, and normally they'd have food there for you to have, free food. You'd go in the rain, whether it's in the winter, because normally what would happen is there would be a culmination, that there would be a big activity taking place. I remember when the Deptford Fire happened, and I remember going on the march to the Deptford Fire and the Black People's Day of Action. And suddenly there'd been moments when all of these factions, all of these groups, all of this would converge at a particular moment. And you suddenly started to greet people and like, I didn't realize you was part of that. I remember when the All African People Revolutionary Party came over to the UK with Marenga Bambata. You know, that was a new addition. And they used to wear white and they had a lot of very powerful ideas, but then so did Rasta. So I look at it as somebody that's learning. You always wanted to get the best thing available, and you couldn't get it from any one thing, but you could actually get it from a range of things. So I'm in agreement with Leila that the fact that we just needed to be educated, mobile, and also it was about what tools did you need, and those places provided us with the tools, and that's why 3 of us are representative of the cumulative impact of the tools we acquired 30, 40 years ago, and we still have them, but just in a different way. So that was my experience.
Yeah, I agree actually that all of the movements that were going on, whether it was in the UK or whether it is in the USA or the Caribbean or wherever it was, that had an influence. But I would say that I probably relate more to Black Unity and Freedom Party because I grew up in Southwark and Brixton, and they were involved in things that were happening right there, you know, in the time that I was growing up. So we had the Brixton riots, we had the New Cross fire, we had that massive People's Day of Action, which is the biggest mobilization of Black people we've seen, you know, but probably until now, you know, with some of the Black Lives Matter protests, with thousands of people marching, involved in justice campaigns, campaigns against police brutality. In fact, you know, you mentioned at the beginning in the introduction that I'm the national chair of BLAM UK, and I co-founded with Lee Jasper BLAM UK 10 years ago. We've just marked our 10-year anniversary, and effectively, even though we were initiated as an anti-austerity organisation focused on the disproportionate impact of austerity on Black workers, communities and service users, in fact, what we saw is hand in hand with that austerity impact came deepening injustice and racism faced by Black communities. And so our remit broadened to cover all of that. And we've been campaigning on really similar issues to those movements at that time over the last 10 years that we've existed, supporting family justice campaigns, organising protests and marches, lobbying government, legal challenges, you know, organising some of the things that Black Lives Matter are doing now, doing solidarity vigils and marches against deaths at the hands of the state, both in the UK and in the USA. Like, for example, we hosted Trayvon Martin's family in the UK. So I would say that for me, I can really connect more with them more than any of the other groups, just because of what I do now has clearly been influenced by what happened then, in terms of carrying on that tradition of mobilizing and organizing. And I agree with the points about being free movements, because when we founded BLAM, we said that if you're in Manchester, if you're in Bristol, or if you're in Sheffield, and you want to come together as a group of Black people, we'll support you to help you set up. Just call yourself BLAM UK. You know, we weren't pinned down with having to have elections and this, that, and the other, and processes. We're more focused on what's happening to our communities. Let's get out there and mobilize and come together, than, you know, holding positions and going through a lot of bureaucracy. Because as far as I was concerned, or we were concerned, we didn't have time for that bureaucracy. There's too much happening to us out there that we need to deal with.
In 1985, when they had the Black People's Day of Action, I was one of the lead stewards, and I remember we had to walk from Brixton to Hyde Park. And right at the front of the march was a group of South African women. So it wasn't like just walking. It was very much like South Africans when they're going into battle or for a funeral. It was like a jog. When we got to Hyde Park, the police surrounded Hyde Park, and we got in there, and it was a lot of activists. But suddenly the Broadwater Farm collective, based on the riots in '85, turned up about 3 trucks where they were all on the back, balaclavaed up. And it was because of Cherry Gross and Cynthia Jarrett. And suddenly there must have been about 10,000 of us in Hyde Park, because I remember it was cold, but I just remembered the sheer diversity of what was present that day, from just inner city people that were impacted by Cynthia Jarrett, people from Brixton. There were people from all over the country unified by these events that were taking place that manifested in some of the uprisings. So, you know, there are moments when we've actually all come together, and there was no dissension. We represented different things, because as an outsider to London, that thing about being London centric, people like Beanie and those of us from Nottingham, a guy called Leroy Wallace was a very famous activist, but he passed away, who not many people know that he was very, very prominent in the Pan-Africanist movement, but he passed very early. And so the reality of it is that whether you was a poet, it was almost felt like the Titanic, that if the ship's sinking, we all have to kind of hands on deck and get the water over the side. And also I wanted to say, one of the things that these organizations brought is an understanding of tactical ways of marching. There was ways in which African women who fronted a march, there was ways in which when we get to a place to avoid the kind of conflict with the police. So a lot of the ways for thousands of people, there was a lot of strategy. Some of it didn't work all the time because the police also had their strategy. But what I can say is the way that we used to march, position ourselves, was as a consequence of how those political movements helped us understand how you're supposed to organize and march and protest and make your point with the least amount of collateral damage.
Okay. So the Black People's Day of Action was 81 though, wasn't it?
Was it 81?
Yeah, Black People's Day of Action is 81.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Apologies for that.
Okay. I was just going to say it's really important the fact that you guys have highlighted that even though there was many different organizations at the time, the end goal was always Black liberation. So whether or not it was a that group, the medium was always the same and the goal was always the same. And I think it was just more about being involved and collectively having solidarity as opposed to which group it was. It's just about getting the movement going really. And I think that's very important to note. So I'm going to move on to the next question. I was going to say, what key moment or event showed you that Black internationalism was very much alive in the UK?
Well, right now, Black Lives Matter, it has to be. That's absolutely, I mean, the key moment on Black internationalism has to be the international movement for Black Lives Matter, which has been in nearly every country in the world. So, I mean, I read the question. I wasn't sure whether you meant historically or whether you meant now, but right now it has to be Black Lives Matter. Yeah,
I think both, because particularly looking at a lot of people, they talk about, the UK's never really been involved. And I know that you guys have spoken or mentioned, I think it would be good if you went into a bit more depth about some of the Black internationalist movements that were prominent in the UK. And obviously FESTAC was one big thing that showed culturally Black internationalism, but in the UK, things that were organized. I know you guys have mentioned the book fair. So maybe just talk about that, those kind of things as well. So
there is a moment for me. There was a poetry collective called African Dawn. African Dawn was made up of many African exiles, and they came together to form this amazing performance group. When I first met them, it was a real education. But I remember through African Dawn, there was the Last Poets were reforming and were performing at the Africa Centre in Covent Garden, and I was asked to compare. And I know it sounds strange. I'm not saying it's about being starstruck, but I'd grown up on the Last Poets and Gilskirk Heron, and I walked into this room, a little room, and I seen the Last Poets. And the reason it was relevant for me is because in 1985, when Sugar Hill Gang came out with Rapper's Delight, suddenly the music changed. Reggae changed. There was a lot of dynamics that changed in 1985. When the Last Poets came across, Gilskirk Heron, African Dawn, they restored the politics of things like the spoken word, because we didn't have leadership in that sense. We looked to the African poets, we looked to African American poets, because we didn't have the same platform and profile. And I just remember there was a period, even when I met Ngugi wa Thiong'o, which again was another amazing thing, Edward Braithwaite. So I don't know about the other speakers, but there was a particular period of time from about 1981 to me to about the end of that decade, where the writers, the performers, the bookshops, there were so many things that shaped my consciousness in that particular period. And it culminated in a lot of activity at places like the Africa Centre. And also, I suppose another thing for me was the first time I saw Shaka perform, because I've heard about Shaka, and I walked into a sound dance, and all I saw was about 100 people standing around in a circle, and I thought a fight was breaking out. And I walked through and I opened up and I saw this guy operating the whole sound system, putting the records on. He had a sound effects box. And the first time I saw Shaka, for me, I'd never seen anybody could produce a show on a sound system like him. And his music, Shaka reminded me of John Coltrane. His music was completely different to any other reggae sound system. So I have to say, for me, it was a cumulative amount of things. I can't cite one thing. It was lots of things that would converge and make it. It was like going to an all-you-can-eat buffet, and you come out and that's the meal. But it's all the things that were on the menu, and there was numerous back in that time.
Mm.
There's a few things actually I would like to mention that come to my mind, and I agree with the point that Leila's made about Black Lives Matter, you know, now in this time. One of the things I wanted to mention was the boycott campaign and the anti-apartheid movement. Yep. Whilst that was a white and black movement, my parents, I grew up, that was part of my activism as a child, is I grew up with the boycott campaign, with my parents were part of it. So I knew, don't ever buy anything South African, boycott South African goods, and that's how I learned about apartheid. But when I was a teenager, my dad lived in Lesotho, and Lesotho is surrounded by South Africa. So you can't enter South Africa, you can't enter Lesotho without going through South Africa. So I witnessed and experienced apartheid firsthand. And I had to cross borders to get to Lesotho, but I made the decision to go across the border of my own accord with my dad to Bloemfontein because I wanted to see and experience firsthand. And I used that experience to campaign back in the UK. And then I became part of the anti-apartheid movement and organised student boycotts at art school and so on. And through that, what I learned is that actually within the anti-apartheid movement, there were black sections, and they're not necessarily known that much, you know, in terms of the UK. But what that black sections did, it brought black people together to campaign, not just against apartheid, because it was recognised it was crucial and important within an anti-apartheid movement. You need to have black people at the forefront, so that's why they formed the black structures. But it influenced that what was happening in South Africa and what African people were doing in South Africa to fight for their own freedoms, plus the anti-apartheid movement, inspired or strengthened black people both in the USA and the UK to fight the racism they were facing in the countries they were living in. So that to me was, you know, an element of an international movement against racism. And against obviously apartheid and structural racism as well. And the other thing I wanted to mention was the Bristol bus boycott. And I learned about the Bristol bus boycott not through school or any, you know, education in schools. I was doing an assignment for art school and doing some work for the Caribbean Times, again in my late teens, went to Bristol to investigate a story that was related to a murder. I was doing photography for the newspaper, and Paul Stevenson was the person we went to meet. And I got an education in that day of everything. He took us all around Bristol, told us about everything, you know, in terms of the history with the slave trade, but also, of course, his crucial role in the Bristol bus boycott. But the Bristol bus boycott was inspired by the Montgomery bus boycott and Rosa Parks, and it led to the first race legislation in the UK. So I think that's important. And finally, I wanted to mention something that is happening now that I'm part of. How well known it is another matter. But UNESCO set up a few years ago a coalition of artists for the general history of Africa. So between the 1960s and 90s, and actually they've added 3 more volumes. They wrote 8 volumes of the history of Africa, you know, going back in time, because of the fact that in schools and in our education systems, we're taught, particularly in the UK, you know, we're forced education that we began as slaves. And so they felt it was important for the African diaspora to educate young black people, young Africans across the diaspora on actually the amazing and wonderful and enriched culture and histories we have and empires through time as a way of countering the racism that they face today and prejudice that they face today. So UNESCO decided to go out to artists of every genre across genres who can use their art to raise awareness of the volumes and use that as a sort of educational tool to empower Black people. So it's not necessarily as well known as it should be, but one of my roles as one of those UNESCO representatives is actually to bring awareness of that. So that's why I wanted to mention it in this event, particularly because we're talking about arts and activism and how the two fuse together.
Okay, so for me, just because of Black Lives Matter, very much about Black internationalism, but historically, Martin's mentioned the book fairs that we held, these international book fairs of radical Black and Third World books, where speakers would come from all over, artists would come and perform from all over the Black diaspora in England. But in part of the movements that we were involved in were very internationalist, because many of the demonstrations, the pickets for Walter Rodney, the invasion of Grenada, the South African Liberation Movement, the fight for independence in Mozambique, Angola, and Guinea-Bissau. As activists, they were as much our bread and butter as fighting police brutality in England was. So we always had a very big internationalist element to the work that we did, and we published and we spoke about and spoke on platforms that very much talked about African liberation and Third World liberation as being part of the movements that we were involved in, and movements that were important to change in Britain as well, because we were all then formerly colonial peoples who had come to Britain and settled. So that whole anti-colonial struggle as well was very important to us.
Thank you for sharing that. The next question is that around this time in the 1780s, we had a range of different community-owned medium forms in the UK. Why was this the case, and how important were these medium forms? Who wants to lead on that?
So when you say medium forms, do you mean newspapers, cultural institutions?
Newspapers, yes.
All of that. And the question is, why was that the case, and how important were they? So we're thinking of like Choice FM, the first Black-owned radio station, West Indian World, as it was before, that became The Voice, those kinds of things. Arif Ali's Publishing House, Hansib. Well, these were people who had come to Britain, and in order to put forward the point of view of the kind of immigrant communities as we were then, and then the communities that were born here, decided that because Britain wasn't representing, or British establishment or the British society wasn't representing who we were, that we needed to do it for ourselves. So that was the reason for that. So we had a Black-owned radio station, which we all listened to for Black music. We looked at Black media, and that's simply because British society was not doing it. And rather than beg and be victims and moan, we decided we would do it for ourselves.
The other thing as well, and I mean, I use a criminological perspective. If you go back to the 60s and 70s and you study the newspapers of the time and look at Black representation, it's very clear what was represented. It was very racist, right-wing views. Those, even in things like Ebony magazine, Jet magazine, the Black publishing industry was one of the important indicators that you were more than what the mainstream press was presenting. It was also important to see yourself in other situations. A lot of young people, certainly when I was growing up on the streets, it was horrible. Everybody talks about the good old days. A lot of what we faced was not the good old days. We romanticize about it, especially I hear people romanticizing about it wasn't the good old days. We just made the best out of what we had. But the importance of those things were, it was an accessible way for you to see yourself reflected. Remember, we didn't have these mediums that you have now. We didn't have none of that. And I was amazed at how the circulation of those newspapers was as regular as what they were. I was amazed that the circulation reached the north. So not only did they, the people that created these produce the material, they produced distribution networks, advertising, all of the stuff you see in so-called mainstream, but back in the day, those imprints was our mainstream because we weren't part of any other thing. And I say even to this day that they not only they need to be commended, but sometimes in places like Fleet Street, they also need to recognize, and that's what Black Lives Matter is doing, is making so-called mainstream understand that we've been here for a very, very long time. We've contributed, and we've contributed on every level. It's just it's been suppressed, it's remained hidden, and it needs to be reflected and brought back and actually retold that not only did we contribute, but we were good journalists. Some of those newspapers led to TV shows that came on, like Black and Black, Ebony. So out of some of that became a visual presence on TV. I was one of the writers for The Real McCoy. And I remember that when The Real McCoy first come out, I mean, when I was first approached to this, I've never seen anything like it. I thought, nah, this can't be true. A comedy show full of black people. And the actual script editor for The Real McCoy went on to produce Goodness Gracious Me. And The Real McCoy got dropped. So if you look at the media representation across the board, we owe a great deal to the founders of those newspapers who gave a platform, photographed us, interviewed us in a way that we need to recognize and place some value, and not just put it in a historical context, because The Voice is still here. And a lot of those journalists from The Voice have gone on to do great things in other areas. And it needs to be recognized that we've made that contribution and still making it.
Thank you.
So I would say that racism is why they existed, because we needed to organize our own things, because we were never going to get it through the mainstream, and we were blocked and we faced discrimination. And why they were important, it was a way for us to communicate with us about us and document what we were doing, share information with each other, and actually be able to have platforms before there was any social media where we could actually express ourselves, document our histories and our stories and events that were happening to us, and be creative, you know, and share our creativity and our culture with each other. So they were massively important. And I mentioned that, you know, I've had a whole journey with Hansib publications, having had that work experience with them as a teenager when I was at art school, which led to me learning about important historical events like the Bristol bus boycott, but also lots of other things that were going on at the time in terms of racism and injustice, to them publishing my first book. So they're still here, and so the legacies that they created are still with us today, so we shouldn't forget that either.
Thank you. So we're moving on to the last question before we open it up to the audience. I've seen a few questions that are really interesting already, so I'm looking forward to asking you those soon. And last question is, what are some of the blueprints from Black organizing in the 70s and 80s that you feel upcoming activists and change makers need to grasp or know?
I would just say this.
They need
Sorry,
to.
Zita.
Shall I go? Or do you want to go?
Yeah, no, you go. No, you go, Zita.
Okay. Sorry. I don't know whether they need to grasp them or note them, and it's not for me to dictate what they should or shouldn't do in that respect.
Well, not know about things that they're looking back in hindsight that you think would be helpful. It's just suggestions.
Yeah. I understand. But what I would like to talk about, well, I'm a lifelong trade unionist. So actually, we haven't spoken about trade unionism here. We talked more about, you know, grassroots community activism. But I thought actually it would be quite important to share something about Black trade union movement. And in the 1980s, and way before up until the 1980s, up until the 1990s, we were still facing resistance. In fact, in the 1930s, there were unions established by Black people, and Black in the political sense, because people understood the importance of coming together from across the African and Asian diaspora because of the common discrimination that people were facing as migrants to the UK. And there was a union for the film industry. It's the first Black trade union that was set up for the film industry, and they were actually rejected by the Trade Union Congress. And in the Bristol bus boycott I mentioned, it was actually the trade union at the time that passed a motion barring Black people coming to work on the buses for the company, because they thought it would take away jobs from British workers. So Black trade unionists came together and mobilized and organized themselves, actually in the workplace, but also in the community. And they organized around the issues they were facing in terms of the Immigration Act at the time, and the impacts of colonialism, as well as the discrimination and barriers and bars they were facing in the workplace and in the wider labor movement. And right up until the 80s and 90s, we were still having to face that resistance and campaign against it and challenge it. And it was Black trade unionists that had to come together and self-organize to force the trade union movement to actually let us have a foot in the door. And we had to insist and fight that we have Black structures in the union, because initially they were sort of advisory committees to the decision-making bodies. And we were like, no, we need our own Black trade union structures in our unions and in the TUC. And that led to us having the TUC Black Workers Conference. And actually it was together with the Labour Black sections that this work was carried out, and this campaigning was done to fight for our rights to have a voice in the trade union movement. And I I was part of this movement as a young trade unionist, and I formed a self-organized group called Ethnic Majority, because I don't like the term, ethnic minority and BAME either very much. And so we called it Ethnic Majority because of the fact we're a global majority. And you remember that Angela Davis talked about that. And we had to force my trade union at the time to allow us to, well, not to allow us, because we insisted that we have Black structures and that the union needs to fight for race equality. And we worked all these years to, address underrepresentation and discrimination within the trade union movement, as well as in the workplace. So that's what I would like to mention, the role of Black trade unionists, those whose shoulders I stand on today, who came through before and fought and resisted for us to have our voices and to make sure we had rights in the workplace.
Okay, so I agree with Zita about blueprints and, saying to people, what you need to grasp. But I think for my role as an activist and throughout my career and what I've been doing is it's always to listen to the movement, listen to what the movement is saying. Don't try to tell people what to do. Don't put yourself in the role of I'm the leader and, this is how we're going to do it, but to listen to what people are saying and see if you can form an organization that can take those demands forward and have a real impact and lasting change.
For me, I'm going to use my experience in prison. For 40 years, I've worked in prisons to enable Black offenders to represent themselves in a structure that oppresses them. And one of the things by setting up dialogue groups, and I learned this here and in the States when I worked in American prisons, because we never really look a lot at the tail end. In the last 40 years, the prison population has doubled, and exponentially when you see the Black prison population, when you see the rise in gang culture and stuff like this, they're an integral part of the community, but they're a difficult part of that community. But so what I do in my role in university or in the community is to put a lot of emphasis on the importance of the tools that you provide for the movement around research and development. One of the key things for me is how people research history, because in a digital age, I mean, one of the things that was mentioned before is about the importance of digitization. But also with digitization becomes a research problem because you can hide stuff. In a library, you can go to a library, get library cards out, and you can hunt books. You go to the British Library, you can do that. But when you go to the National Archives, when you go to where they house stuff that's digitized, so one of the key things for me, and I'm like the others, I'm a grandparent, and I've learned with children who are big, you don't tell people what to do. You don't tell grown people what. You just don't tell people what to do. But for me, I've learned from prison, enabling prisoners to fight their own case, enabling prisoners to be able to investigate how and why they were incarcerated, and to mount some of the challenges to the system. Black Lives Matter, which I've loved seeing its evolution when it started 4 or 5 years ago, and the things that went before. But one of the key things that underpins all of these movements is also research and development, information, data. So one of the things for me that's important is for young people, data could come from newspapers, data could come from, I'm doing some work at the moment on hanging. Now, the relevance of it is, I'm trying to understand the impact of hanging on women who were executed in the UK in the last 100 years. The only way I've been able to understand the impact of hanging is to understand court transcripts. I've had to look at records when people are executed. I've had to study the legislative side of who sanctioned it. And what I realize is, in the last 100 years, the vast majority of women who were executed shouldn't have been executed. The only way I could do that is to actually interrogate this material, to start to make recommendations or to revise what we think the issue actually is. I was looking at autopsy reports, and I got the autopsy report of Ruth Ellis, who was executed in 1956. When you start to look at the industry that executed people, yet in schools we don't teach lynching. Well, lynching was state-sanctioned terrorism. It was sanctioned by the state. It involved lynching. There's so many things when you look at criminal justice that requires investigation. So when we're looking at the impact of policing, during COVID-19, domestic violence is on the increase. So what I'm suggesting is, and it's not me saying that this is what most people must do, but the reason I create data verbalization is to take research that I do so that people on the streets in the community can understand it in a form that they can utilize it. So I'm suggesting that research and evaluation. To the speakers we've got tonight, go and look at the work that they've done. Go and read those articles that are in boxes. Go and understand how archives work and build a body of insight and knowledge and wisdom to contest and challenge the power. Because one thing we haven't talked about today, I'm sure the other speakers might have something to say on this, is how do you speak truth to power and truth to history? And for me, having sat in Number 10, having talked to politicians here and abroad, I also know that we need to have conversations on many, many different levels. And one of the things about unions that is key, my stepfather was there at the birth of unions. And I always remember in my house, if you weren't a member of a union, he used to get really upset. And the reality of it is, this was a working class guy who used to read 10 books a week. And I just remembered the knowledge that he had. And when he was a union activist, trust me, he studied socialism, everything that was associated with organizing. And he was also one of these people that studied the Peterloo Massacre. He studied all the movements that informed how unions came about. And so my early foray into looking at history and social change came because I lived in a house with a union activist that was born in 1910, who went through the Second World War, whose father went through, his grandfather went through the Crimean War. So one thing I learned from him is the importance of organization, but it's the information that was passed through the propaganda, the leaflets, the British Radical Society that used to sit in pubs and plan and plot, because they had material that they used to read through the newspapers and stuff like this. So for me, research and evaluation to provide young people, and as older people, we are the custodians of some of that information. So I'd also say that we need to be accountable and make what we've had accessible in ways that that younger generation can do it their way.
I like that. Very powerful. Thank you. So we're going to just answer a few questions because there's quite a few that's coming from the chat. So the first one is from Malika. She says, how can we keep the momentum of discussing and tackling oppression, systemic racism in our everyday life while looking after ourselves and not burning out?
Okay, so I think the Black Lives Matter movement is a rallying call for action. And we still face horrific racism in the UK. So I think that creating safe spaces where people can talk about those things is important. We've just been talking about trade unions. So I would say joining a union is important so you can be part of the conversation in the trade union and part of the solution in raising issues and campaigning on issues. But also creating safe spaces. There are lots of movements that are out there that you can join to engage and have those conversations and organise and campaign, whether it's Black Lives Matter, whether it's Barrack UK, whether it's the Windrush justice campaigns that I'm involved in. There are a whole host of spaces, but sometimes actually creative spaces, you know, with groups of friends, are also equally as important, because you know that you feel safe in those circles, but it's unloading the burden of what you're living through and coming up with collective solutions by having the conversations with others that you feel comfortable around.
Nice. Anyone else want the answer? I'll move on to
I would just say the way not to burn out is not to be isolated. I mean, much of what Zita said, but it's to meet with people who think like yourself and just have a small, like a book club or whatever, but be with other people who you can communicate with, and don't feel that you're isolated and that you're, you know, on your own. And because that's one of the reasons that people do feel burnt out, and I think isolation, just ensure that doesn't happen to you, and you put in your own systems to ensure that you don't get to feel that way.
One of the things I'd like to just add to that is, if you're surrounded by elders, just ask them how have they survived, because we also have a lived experience. I'm not saying we've all survived and we haven't got ill. What I'm suggesting is an intergenerational conversation is asking that question about how have I managed to do 40 odd years? How has anybody done this amount of time? Because it's been arduous, it's been difficult. So I think it's about creating intergenerational spaces where people, because to tell the truth, when Black Lives Matter kicked in, when George Floyd happened, my phone was ringing, everybody was getting in touch. But I remember a group of my students was saying, come on, Martin, you know, let's go out and come on to the streets. And I said, no. And I remember saying, no. I said, it's hard, it's tiring. So I also think that it's also for us as older people, sharing with young people that it's okay not to go out sometimes. It's okay to just sit and just stand still and to be reflective, because I would say I've been sustained by the music. I've been sustained by a community. I've been sustained by purpose. But nowadays with technology, everything's different nowadays, which requires a different strategy. But what doesn't change, and I think it's already been said, is don't be isolated, but access the wisdom of people who've survived a significant period of time, and what can you gain from it? Otherwise, it becomes coercive, where you're telling people what to do. And I don't have the energy to say to somebody like my son's age, it's very hard to say to a 24-year-old, sit down and don't go out. But what it is important, when he says to me, yo, Dad, when you was out there my age, what did you do? The moment I say, so you know, somewhere, it's not that time now, but I'm going to learn this bit from it. I can tell you this, working in prisons. When a guy gets a life sentence and he's got 35 years and he's locked up 18 hours a day, he's got a huge amount of time to process that. And the one thing I also have to do is, in the community, when people are active, they can burn out. In prison, when you're active in trying to reform a prison, especially for black men and black women, you have the opposite, which is the psychology of mental ill health. So in prisons, It's about how do you preserve your well-being over a sustained period of time where you're in lockdown constantly. And in the community, how do you also preserve your health and well-being at a time when everybody wants it now?
Powerful. Thank you. All right, so I'm gonna answer the next question, which is by a teacher called Julie. She says, "What would you change about your school experiences?" She's a white teacher trying to make a change in a predominantly black school.
School experiences, did you say?
Mm-hmm. She said, "What would you change about your school experiences?" And she's a white teacher trying to make a change in a predominantly black school at the moment.
Well, the fact that there was no black history taught when I was going to school. But having said that, it was a tokenistic approach even when my son went to school. So I ended up having a black history curriculum for him at home before he even started school. And in fact, he ended up teaching the teachers. So I think that's crucial, but it shouldn't just be in the history curriculum. The history of black people, it's going back to what I was saying about that, the UNESCO project I'm involved in, teaching our histories throughout time and embedding a sense of worth and value in people, but also trying to prevent a generation of young white people growing up with racist views, because if they're growing up with fascist or racist parents, where are they going to get any other perspective or balance other than in schools? So that's really important, that history is taught truthfully. And we've just seen something come out about citizenship tests, where there's a question, which is telling a lie about our history as black people. So I think teachers have a very, very important role, but not just to teach, but to listen and to understand and acknowledge the experience of racism and what that means and what that feels like and what people go through, young people as well, children as well. So creating those spaces to have those conversations, with black and white children, so that people can learn. They can learn from each other and learn from their experiences and grow up, united against racism.
I teach Black Studies at Birmingham City University, and one of the fundamental principles of Black Studies is community engagement. If a school is there to serve the needs of its community around education, social mobility, and all sorts of stuff, therefore, if white teachers are asking that question in 2020, the likelihood is they're not connected to community, because in the community, you got from dumpling shops, nail salons, you've got the church. I mean, there's so many in the black community. There's an inordinate amount of educators, people with knowledge, insight, role models for schools. But what tends to happen is that schools tend to occupy, they're in a vacuum. Many teachers may come from outside the area. Schools traditionally are part of the community. They're not separate. They're not locked in the middle. And I would say that any school that's not connected to community, where people's are shaping the minds of those young people on a positive tip, the school needs to look at its outreach program. So I would say that every teacher that does an away day that's looking at the next computer system needs to spend more time doing outreach work and working alongside the youth workers, working alongside the activists and the trade unions and the community, basically. But what happens is, because we're now in a neoliberal agenda, which is about protecting the elite side of schools, then a lot of students get left out. And I see this in higher education with the attainment gap. The attainment gap in higher education starts in primary school. So when you look at young black children as young as 7, from 7 to 11, 11 to 16, 16 to 19, and plus, the attainment gap exponentially gets worse. So as far back as 7, you're seeing those impacts felt, because there's no connectivity to the community. And so in some respects, there needs to be more of a public relations campaign where schools stop seeing themselves as we're the authorities on your children's future, and say they should be working in partnership with all of the other people in the community who those kids go home to at the end of the day. And in my experience, from my point of view, looking at the statistics about the attainment gap, secondary schools, primary schools have got a lot to answer for in creating the basis for an attainment gap that is between 10 and 20% in certain parts of the country. So to me, it's about engaging with community, but also not just listening. It's about active listening, but it's also creating praxis. because praxis is the ability for communities to represent and transform themselves. A lot of our young people are capable of transforming many different things, but they have to deal with the power structure. So I would say that teachers are obligated, like what we have to do in Black Studies, to create engagement with community. But if you study the history of education in this country, they left it to Saturday schools, and there's more to education than Saturday schools. That's a very important part. So I would say that the teachers need to be more proactive in community, and in particular the Black community.
Thank you. Leila, do you want to add to that, or should we?
Not really. I mean, I'm glad Martin touched on this thing about academies and the whole elite attainment issue that's going on, which is the reason why now so many Black students are going into referral units. It's to do with the targets that some of these schools have to reach. I wouldn't talk about my own school experience, which is many years ago, but I would say just to have knowledge of your pupils, their issues, how they live, and how you can bring that experience into the classroom is very, very important.
Yeah, I would agree with that. That's exactly what BLAM advocates for when we go into schools, doing teacher training, and we support young people. We're all about centering the lived experience of Black people and bringing that into the classroom and normalizing their lived experience as well. So I think that is really important.
The other thing I wanted to say as well is this is not really about teachers. This is about parents. Regardless of the constitution of your family, understanding the way the governance of a school works. And that's where activism comes in. There are certain things schools can do, and there's certain things that schools can't do. And so in some respects, I would say to any teacher who's sitting in listening to this, they need to be studying what Black Lives Matter's done. Because what it's done, it's set a chain of events in motion that if it could be sustained. I had a colleague recently ask me what they can do. And this is no word of a lie, this is the response I got. I said, if you want to help me, immerse yourself in my pain, try and alleviate some of the suffering, but don't ask me to help you. And the person said to me, well, no, come on, Martin, you're joking. I said, no, I'm not joking. Because the difference between now and then is that there's a difference between Black empowerment and educating white people about Black people. Now, I know no 12-week course is going to educate you on the 400 years and what went before to alleviate some of that suffering. So at the end of the day, this is about understanding that even this panel discussion here, you've got some highly educated, knowledgeable, insightful people. But if you say how many educational conferences invite people like us, I can't speak for anybody else. I can only speak for me. I don't get invited. And yet I've got 3 children, 5 grandchildren, and a great-grandchild. So I look at it, even our combined experiences of parenting, grandparenting, and great-grandparenting is still not taken as data to suggest something's gone wrong. But what's happening is, like in higher education, the system is struggling because in a neoliberal environment, it's all about statistical analysis and metrics. So suddenly now people are asking questions about representation of Black people. If you study critical race theory, it's called interest convergence. It's now in the interest of white society to change. And so therefore, let's change, because we've been advocating for change for 40 odd years. Now it suddenly becomes in other people's interests. And that's central to critical race theory about interest convergence. So I look at it, the question is not what are Black people going to do for white teachers? It's what are white teachers now going to do to ensure equity within a system that disproportionately fails Black people. Absolutely. And that's not a question for me, that's a question for the governance of school, the minister or the person that runs this state for education. And it's also about curriculum developers to understand there is no reason upon this earth other than protecting nationalist interests around the curriculum to make it more balanced. But again, I would say to teachers who are listening to this, go and read the way that the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, the Black Panthers, and all the other movements had to argue and fought and won some marginal gains around education. So it's about also reading history.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to a couple of questions I'm seeing. There's one that says, how do you pressurize the education system? I think we kind of touched on this a little bit, to emphasize Black history internationally, or to at least not hide it, even when it's relevant to the current curriculum. And I think you kind of touched on that a little bit. Martin, does anyone else want to touch on that a little bit? Do you think it's been covered enough?
Yeah, I think it's been covered.
Yeah. The last question we have is, how do you revive the 20th century Saturday school philosophy in today's main framework of the dispersal of Black unity?
So that again, I missed some of that.
How do you revive the 20th century Saturday school philosophy in today's main framework of the dispersal of Black unity?
Oh, is that the? Sorry, I'll respond to that. There's a movement that's been going on for a long time called third space education. If you take dumpling shops, anywhere Black people go, there are conversations that take place. I mean, if I tell you how many conversations I have in all of the food shops, Tesco, no matter where I am. What I think is important is to recognize what are the complementary elements that our children and our students need. So as well as setting up youth groups, as well as setting up recording studios, as well as setting up a range of other spaces, there are ways to develop after school independent spaces that are fun. One example would be when I was in Baltimore, there was a place where there was a boxing ring and the strap line was no hooks without books. And what would happen is young people who wanted to vent their anger and frustration in the boxing ring had to come to the ring and spend at least an hour and a half doing homework and learning something new before they could go in and box. So what we've done in Birmingham, we've been quite successful in creating a range of, we created a space called the Bless Center, which stands for Building, Learning, Education, Safe Space and Transformation. And we set up a learning environment where people who, whether they come out of jail, whether they're students who are struggling, whether it's parents who are just anguished with their children, could come and receive complementary support in their learning needs. I don't just want to say education, because education is one aspect of learning. And what we did, like in the third space movement, is set up a community-centered space, and we move it from the ivory tower into the ebony tower. So when people come into that space to learn, there is laughter, there is food, there is cultural music, there is a safe space. That's why we call it specifically safe space. So I would advocate that you can turn spaces into learning spaces, because every university right now has to demonstrate community impact, community engagement. And it's called the Teaching and Excellence Framework. You also have the Research and Excellence Framework. So I would suggest that the community should also be saying to universities, we've got spaces here that you need to be sending some of your people to work with our students who are doing degrees, and you can do the same thing for A-levels and GCSEs. So I would say that the Saturday school movement, without the Saturday school movement, many of us would not have gone on to study further alongside the movements that have been mentioned today. Yeah. And I believe that we're at a critical point of our history where we need to provide those spaces. I can't wait for my great-grandson to fail again, because I'm waiting for people who are suffering from an existential crisis to suddenly engage with my son, because unless they do that healing, so we have that responsibility. And I'm saying a lot of us who are older, who are wiser, can create those alongside young people, because I get asked that all the time. And finally, I just want to say that mediums like this, one of the things I have to concede and say to the younger generation, you've created platforms for people like myself to speak in a way that if these didn't exist, I don't know if I'd be seen publicly in the way that I used to be. So I would also say there is a digital way to learn where people like myself can engage with parents and students and teachers. And I'm eternally grateful for having a digital space to talk about stuff like this. So I think maybe digital learning alongside the traditional is really important, especially at a time of COVID-19 where people can't come out.
So yeah, I think that the digital side of it is interesting, because it does give us platforms and opportunities to do things in a different way. And I think that we could, you know, there's opportunities to create all sorts of educational and learning tools online. You know, the creation of apps and programs that people can access, young people can access on their phones and tablets and that sort of thing. I do feel that actually that face-to-face contact though, and speaking and going somewhere on a one-to-one basis, not on a one-to-one basis, but face-to-face basis is really important. And the way the sort of curriculum and educational program has gone over recent years, it doesn't allow the same kind of space as there used to be for field trips. So I think doing some educational work around our history, our culture, our achievements, mentoring programs as well are quite important. I for a number of years did mentoring for the Day of the Girl, which is part of the Women of the World festival, which was a way of girls in schools knowing about or meeting a whole broad range of women in all different professions, and then being matched up with people that were doing things they were interested in doing, and seeing people that look like them doing those things and learning how they did it and what their experiences have been. And I think we could be doing the same thing for young Black people, and that's important, isn't it, when you're aspiring to do something or you know, pursue something, to see and know that there are people just like you doing it. And actually, because of the virtual world we're currently in and the digital world we live in anyway, there's far more opportunity for us to access that information. But I think having those spaces and circles where we sit down, break bread, talk to each other and share stories and those oral histories and passing those down are equally as important too.
Okay. Yeah, I've not got much to add except to say that generally there's much more of an individual philosophy that's governing how we operate now. The individualization, celebrity, individual achievements are things which we tend to know about through social media, through Instagram and other things. So I think restoring that sense of community, once you're part of discussions like this, that's something that's on the onus of all of us to do. And it's something that can be done, whether it's done in a digital way or in a face-to-face way. But I think we should be conscious of how individual many of us have become in this Until Black Lives Matter movement, which has once again restored that really there is a big movement of people who act and feel and face the same issues, and we could restore the community sense through that movement.
Thank you. Well, that takes us to the end of our seminar, webinar, whichever you want to call it. I mean, I'm just feeling revived. I'm feeling excited. I think hearing, you know, all your different stories, but also how they intertwine has been really powerful for me. I think the chat's been, you know, going off. Everyone's really enjoyed everything you've had to say. So I want to just thank you all for coming to spend these few hours breaking bread with us and, you know, just talking about blueprints and how things were done in the past, and just to give us some inspiration going forward about how we can continue to preserve the legacy of Black activism in the UK and also find new and different mediums to keep empowering the community going forward. So thank you again. If you guys have any social medias, please let everyone know. If anyone wants to follow you on anything, if you've got any books coming out, please let us know before we end the broadcast. But I just want to thank you all again for coming.
Thank you very much, Aoife, for inviting. Thank you.
And the same thing, and I just want to say to you that I think what you're doing is important, and I think that there is a movement, and I think that for those of us who are getting older, your generation may want to say, this is what we need from you people, but if not, because we made our own mistakes, and I think it's important that you value the mistakes that you make. You don't have to keep repeating them. But I feel that one thing I'm really impressed with your generation is that you've taken these mediums, and some people abuse them, some people present them in one way, but there's people like yourselves and the people that follow you and the people that have been tuning in tonight that are actually interested in a different narrative. And I trust, may not be in my lifetime, but the narrative will change because you guys will change it. So I really want to thank yourselves for hosting such an activity, because it gives me a chance, to tell the truth, to talk to other people who have been on my journey, but we've never really met as such. and that wouldn't have been able to happen if it wasn't for what you put forward. So I want to thank you for that.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Okay.
Great. And that's the end. We're going to end the broadcast now, but thank you everyone that's tuned in.
Thank you.